Agradeço a intervenção de Ryan Meyer, também por ter sido sucinto e ter conseguido respeitar o tempo, e sobretudo por nos ter chamado a atenção para uma dimensão muito pouco salientada nesta presença da China em África, ou seja, o setor financeiro. Não apenas como base para financiamento de projetos em outros setores, mas em si mesmo como um objetivo importante da presença chinesa em África. E como foi referido, de facto, as questões internas e a evolução da economia interna chinesa tem aqui um conjunto de condicionantes muito importantes para a evolução futura. E não resisto a juntar apenas um elemento que tem a ver com o facto de existir não apenas excesso de recursos que têm que ser canalizados no exterior, têm que ser reciclados no exterior, mas existir na China também um problema neste momento, digamos, complicado, que é o excesso de capacidade produtiva em muitos setores. Ou seja, houve um sobreinvestimento nestes últimos anos e isso está a colocar problemas de eficiência graves, não é? E de subsistência de muitas empresas. E, portanto, esta questão é, digamos, essencial para a manutenção e a estabilidade do modelo de desenvolvimento chinês. Mas sem mais, e porque foram levantadas aqui um conjunto de questões tão interessantes, nós vamos ter meia hora para debate, conseguir negociar 10 minutos, estendemos, portanto, tentaremos até à 1h15, e penso que a riqueza das questões e o nível digamos, do debate certamente suscitou muitas perguntas e comentários do lado da assistência. A palavra.
Meu nome é Jorge Arbache, sou do BNDES. Eu queria, antes de tudo, agradecer aos apresentadores pelas excelentes exposições, com as quais eu aprendi bastante. Eu tenho três pequenas perguntas para o senhor Vitor Gal. A China, como a segunda maior economia do mundo desde o ano passado, ou o início desse ano, sendo a China a segunda maior economia do mundo, eu gostaria de perguntar ao senhor Vitor Gal se a China está considerando aumentar a cooperação com a África, por exemplo, através da sua maior participação no Banco Africano de Desenvolvimento ou a sua maior participação no AIDA, no Banco Mundial, ou outras formas de cooperação que não tenham interesses comerciais vinculados. A segunda pergunta, na verdade, é mais um comentário. O senhor mencionou que o que é mais necessário para a China é capacity building, com o qual eu concordo, mas eu acho que tão ou mais importante que capacity building é governança. Talvez seja esse o maior de todos os problemas para que a China consiga crescer de forma mais sustentável e possa aproveitar todos os benefícios que os minerais e outras riquezas do continente possam trazer para a sua população. E a terceira questão está vinculada a um comentário do senhor a respeito da não concorrência entre o Brasil e a China. Nós sabemos que a China hoje importa basicamente commodities do Brasil, alguma coisa como 90% ou 95% das exportações brasileiras hoje são de commodities, enquanto que a maior parte das importações do Brasil da China são de bens manufaturados, muitos deles de alta tecnologia. Eu gostaria de saber se o senhor acha que a taxa de câmbio chinesa pode ajudar a explicar esse padrão de comércio entre Brasil e China. Obrigado.
Thank you very much for your questions addressed to me, and I will try to answer them as quickly as possible. For your first question, China is actually demanding that the current international financial system need to be significantly changed and restructured, mainly because China feels that the developing country as a whole does not have sufficient representation at institutions like the World Bank and IMF. Now, more recently, as a result of the financial crisis and as a result of the increase of the weighting of developing countries, especially countries like China and India and Brazil, China's percentage of voting rights in World Bank and IMF has been increasing recently. That's a very positive sign. But when China looks at that, China is not satisfied just to see its own kind of a percentage rating increase. China is demanding that the developing countries should have at least 50% voting right at World Bank. Therefore, I think China is doing two things. One, when it engages with different African countries, China is increasing its commitment, China is increasing its cooperation level, but separately on the other side, China is also increasing its participation in the World Bank and IMF. Now, for governance, I think governance is one of the most important things because without transparency and governance, FDI will be exposed to a lot of risks. However, one thing which is China is very hesitant about is how to define governance level. Whether you want to impose what you believe to be the right thing onto another country. For many years, China was lectured upon by many other countries, and China was very much humiliated. Therefore, China does not want to lecture to other countries in Africa, for example, or China does not want to impose the truth onto other countries. As a matter of fact, I used to be an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. One thing he was very great at was his conclusion that we do not have the truth. What the best we can get is to getting closer to the truth. Therefore, when we talk about governance, while it is very, very important to improve governance, but there is a danger of believing that you have the truth and you want to impose your version of the truth onto other countries. That's number two. Now, for the competition between China and Brazil, I'm a firm believer that China and Brazil can work together for mutual benefit. As a matter of fact, there are other countries as examples for Brazil to look at it. Countries like Australia, which is really hurt by the financial crisis, mainly because its robust trade with China, mostly export of commodities to China, has been held up in the financial crisis. Now, China's currency is appreciating. Let me tell you, ever since 2005, the Chinese currency has appreciated more than 22% against the US dollars. Most of the appreciation took place in the first 3 years, 2005, 2006, 2007. It stopped in 2008. Why did it stop? Of course, because of the financial crisis. And more recently, China has restarted what they call elasticity of the Chinese renminbi yuan, and it's increasing slightly, mainly because there was this Japan president, in the 1980s, where the United States imposed upon very rapid increase of Japanese yuan against the dollar, and as a result, or partially as a result of that, Japanese economy suffered a major contraction, and it's ever since then, for more than 2 decades, it's still kind of in a very dangerous situation. Therefore, I think China does not want to see a sharp rise in the Chinese exchange rates against the dollar. And more recently, because the euro has been depreciating, the pressure on the Chinese yuan is kind of releasing a little bit, because the European countries are no longer demanding that Chinese yuan appreciates significantly against the dollar. So I would say we are all in a market situation eventually. I want to make 2 points. The complete convertibility of the Chinese yuan, which is only partially convertible right now under the capital accounts, but not under the current accounts, and the complete market readjustability of the Chinese yuan will be very important and will be in China's interest. So eventually we need to achieve these 2 goals. These 2 goals will be the preconditions for the Chinese renminbi yuan to become a major reserve currency in the world. Thank you.
Posso fazer uma pergunta primeiro? Meu nome é Denise Gregory, eu sou diretora do Centro Brasileiro de Relações Internacionais. Queria parabenizar, agradecer o excelente nível aí das palestras. Foi bastante informativo e queria dar uma oportunidade para a Hannah de voltar a um aspecto da sua apresentação, principalmente com o olhar sul-africano, sobre a questão da assistência ao desenvolvimento, que eu vi que você ia enfocar ao final e teve que pular, teve que adiantar a sua apresentação.
Yes. Can you...
Okay, yeah, thanks. I have two questions. One is for our South African friends. Obviously, some of the same problems that Brazilian companies encounter because of the presence of Chinese companies, also South African companies encounter. So maybe some thoughts about the experience of South African companies and policymakers in this new environment, and to what extent there can be implications for Brazilian companies and policymakers. And for Victor, whose presentation I very much liked, again, I would like to go back to the point I was raising before about what I, in very plain English, I describe as responsibility of China, which by far has been the most successful developing country over the past 2 decades, 3 decades. Now, it's true what you say that Chinese policymakers have gone their own way to some extent over the past 3 decades, but at the same time, China has been one of the largest, if not the largest, recipient of any kind of ODA over these 3 decades, be it bilateral from Japan and other countries, or multilateral from the World Bank and others. I guess there may be some lessons, again, which can be learned from that experience. Again, resist to say there is no truth. At the same time, some of the messages that came from traditional donors may have a grain of wisdom somewhere. Isn't there a responsibility on the part of China to tell the African friends, look, don't throw out everything with the bathtub?
Muito obrigado. Aqui nas apresentações que eu vi, foi muito acentuada a parceria entre o Brasil e a China, ou eventual concorrência. Mas não foi referida a parceria desses 2 países com os investidores africanos. Quer dizer, a África é vista como um receptor de investidor e não como parceiro no investimento dentro da África. Eu gostaria que elaborasse um pouco mais sobre essa questão. De outra maneira, os slides que a Ana apresentou de neocolonialismo podem ter algum significado, sob o ponto de vista econômico. Quer dizer, é outra forma de intervenção, mas que não conta com a participação interna dos africanos. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I'll start off with the question in the front, which referred basically to my presentation. I think the point that I wanted to make when it comes particularly to South Africa and the South Africa-China relationship is that South Africa is one of the greatest recipients of FDI from China in the continent, rather than actually development assistance and loan financing and the subsidizing of those loans that China extends to a lot of other resource-rich countries, but as Victor also mentioned, to all the countries effectively that have diplomatic relations with China, if it's in the form of schools, of hospitals, the part of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation commitments. More recently, also agricultural demonstration centers, which have been rolled out in 14 African countries. And as we congregate here today, the follow-up on the agricultural commitments at FOCAC 2009 in Egypt are actually being discussed in Beijing. That said, South Africa, in terms of investment, is often seen as a springboard for Chinese companies investing into the continent. You'll see that, for example, Chinese companies enter South Africa and shift their headquarters later from Johannesburg to Zambia, for example. South Africa has the infrastructure, the environment in place, the institutions in place, the markets in place. It is the powerhouse of Africa, effectively. From a technology point of view, from a managerial point of view, and that relates to the banking sector as well as Rian mentioned, and for China to build its global capabilities. I think given that South Africa is seen as a conduit almost of Chinese firms going into the continent rather than as a development partner. Thank you.
I would just like to address the question of how the competition between, or how South African companies experience the involvement of Brazil